plan, which then was tailored in certain ways from region to region. The idea of the plan was that a tribesperson, when they came out of their hut in the morning, would see things in their daily environment that would automatically remind them of the things they'd been taught. And so everyday animals and structures and plants and activities would reinforce the cosmological teaching. And so to do that, if you need a symbol for a serpent, in India it might be a cobra, and in North America it might be a rattlesnake.
Right.
But it's the same symbol. If you need a horned animal, in one area it might be a bull, in another area it might be a ram, in another area it might be something else. So there was certain tailoring that went on to the plan to fit the region in which the plan was being taught.
Well, that makes absolute sense, obviously. Do you think that this is also where the origins lies in terms of our astrological symbols? Have they been given to us in the same manner? I know that there's a lot of researchers out there who are looking at this from the point of view that ancient man discovered this, and we eventually became telling stories with the aid of the star, so to speak. But we potentially might be looking at a situation where the constellations, so to speak, in their formation have been taught to us as well then, right, Laird?
Yes. When you start with this ritual shrine, the stupa or the dogon granary, there's very complex sets of symbolism that associate with this structure. And one of the things they're trying to do, the structure the finished structure as it presents in some of the cultures is like a small pyramid only with a round bottom and staircases that go up the four sides. And each staircase is associated with certain animals in the animal kingdom. One of the things they're trying to accomplish is to provide us with a system for organizing zoology. And so you conceptually think of certain families of animals standing on certain stairs or certain staircases. One staircase is for insects, and one staircase is for fish. One staircase is for four-legged animals, and one is for birds. And so if you understand the symbolism of the structure, you also understand the relationship between these different families of animals and creatures. And it's that symbolism that, in my understanding, eventually produced what we see as astrology.
Do you think that some of the knowledge have been preserved to this day? Obviously, the dogon is still around, so we still have a tradition there, obviously. But I guess what I'm reaching at is, in the Western world primarily, we can look at things like Freemasonry, for instance, which in most cases seem to come from a point of view where they're trying to understand their own symbols. They have a lot of Masonic scholars who are researching their own mythology, their own stories, so to try to understand them. But the serious connection here is kind of obvious to me, but maybe there's other things within Western esoteric traditions as well that echoes of this same story. Would you agree with that, Laird?
I would absolutely agree with that. I see the Masonic tradition as being an offshoot of the same system. Now, to try to understand any given symbol, you need to look for the earliest unperverted reference that you can find. Yeah. Now, in the case of the Dogon and Buddhism, we know for certain that Buddhism started at very least in the late centuries BC. In other words, just before the year zero. In the centuries just before that, we can trace stupas, and we know Buddhism existed. Now, in the Dogon system, we imagine that it goes back earlier than that. But because the two systems match each other, we can conclude from that neither one of them can possibly have changed substantially over time, because if they had, they would no longer match.
Right.
So we know with certainty that the Buddhist system and the Dogon system were a match at about the year zero or just before.
And how far back do you go in terms of the knowledge of the Dogon then? How far back do you think the people have been around, and how you mentioned 13,500 BC? That's a date that usually comes up in a lot of this research, obviously. Do you think that at that given point, that's when they were given the knowledge, Laird?
The Dogon tradition that I'm studying seems to align best around 3500 BC. However, my friend John Anthony West is just back from Göbekli Tepe, which is a megalithic site in Turkey that is thought to be 12,000 years old. And before he left, I presented him with some papers that showed that most of the known symbolism at Göbekli Tepe ties in with the same system of cosmology I'm talking about.
Oh, now this is really interesting because we had the main archaeologist, Klaus Schmidt, actually with us on the program here a while back, and that's going to be available on our website soon as well. And I asked him a little bit about that, some of the animals and some of the astrological aspect and things like that. And he wasn't really prone to go there. He understood the concept and agreed in that sense. But have you studied the site further, Laird? And if so, what can you say more about that?
Okay, I'll give you an example. In Egypt, there is a tradition of what's called the first time.
Zep Tepe, yes.
Zep Tepe. In Turkey, the word Tepe, which goes along with Göbekli Tepe, carries 25 separate definitions. And many of those definitions are, as I've described, logically disconnected from each other, so you can't get to one by knowing the other. If you go to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, so far I've been able to verify that at least 20 of those 25 definitions also exist in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language under the root tepe or related roots. So when the Egyptians are talking about tepe, they're talking about the same concept that the Turks are talking about.
Do you think?
And Zep Tepe could very well, in my opinion, refer back to Göbekli Tepe.
See, that's really, really interesting, obviously. And again, it seemed to suggest that either we had a single language also to begin with at the beginning, but I'd reckon from your point of view, you wouldn't mention that this is a language composed of letters, characters in that sense. That this is a language of symbols, wouldn't you say? It's a symbolic language.
Yes,
that is the first.
It's a symbolic language, but there's also symbolism associated with phonetic sounds.
Ah.
And so in many cases, you can predict what the meaning of a word will be if it's old enough based on its phonetic value.
That's really interesting. So language, obviously, is a big part in the clue here as well, because the words that we give to things today, do you think that they still have a root then in some of these ancient languages and the way that they pronounce them as well? Because in most cases, we end up with a language which has been run through the Greek system, or it's been even Latinized or things like this, right?
Well, yes, but many of the words still hold up remarkably well. I mean, studying Egyptian hieroglyphic language, I come to a much better of an understanding of where many ancient Hebrew words came from, but very often I'll come across roots that make sense in terms of modern languages also.
I've heard suggested that there is a relationship, obviously, between the Hebrew letters and Egyptian hieroglyphics, that the Egyptians also had a writing language in terms of more mundane detailing of things, and I've heard that it's been suggested that Hebrew was this language. Have you been able to find any evidence for something like that, Laird?
Yes. Let me try to put this into a coherent form. It looks to me that the cosmology existed before writing. There's evidence among the pre-dynastic tribes that they worshipped many of the same gods and goddesses, and that they knew about many of the same ritual shapes. Now, in the cosmology, as the cosmology plays out in Buddhism and in the Dogon culture, as you build a stupa or as you build a Dogon granary, you are evoking a series of geometric shapes, and each shape is associated with certain concepts. And the shapes and the concepts match between Buddhism and Dogonism. Now you go to Egyptian hieroglyphic language, and you see that some of these same shapes play out as characters in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, carrying the same meaning, the same traditional meaning, as is known in Buddhism and among the Dogon. And my conclusion from that, my tentative conclusion from that, is that these pre-existing shapes that were associated with concepts were adopted as written